Chancellor for the Faculty of Law, Business and Creative Arts, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today to the professorial inaugural lecture for JCU University, given by Professor Peter Murphy, who's going to talk to us this evening about the big creativity deficit. Why the arts and sciences are dying, and Peter, I want to know what's left after you take the arts and sciences out.
Nothing.
Nothing. Oh, that explains it. Why great creative and research discoveries are in serious decline today, and why you should care. But let me first just tell you a little bit about Professor Murphy. He's a Professor of Creative Arts and Social Aesthetics and the head of the School of Creative Arts at James Cook University. He completed his PhD at La Trobe University under the direction of the distinguished philosopher and social theorist Agnes Heller. Before coming to James Cook University, he held continuing appointments in political science at the University of Ballarat, in the Master of Communication program at Victoria University, Wellington, and in Communications and Media at Monash University, where he was Director of the Social Aesthetics Research Unit. He has held a number of visiting appointments at various universities in America, Greece, Philippines, Denmark, and England. Peter also spent a number of years at the pioneering Australian internet search company LookSmart in editorial and analytical roles. Peter's major research interests concern the nature of creativity and the imagination. He is the author of The Collective Imagination, 2012, and Civic Justice, 2001. He also has co-authored the book Dietetic of Romanticism, A Critique of Modernism, 2004, Creativity in the Global Knowledge Economy, 2009, Global Creation, 2010, and Imagination, 2010, and co-editor of the Philosophical and Cultural Theories of Music, 2010. Murphy, Matheson, and Peter's Imagination, Three Models of Imagination in the Age of the Knowledge, was awarded an American Education Studies Association Critics' Choice Book Award in 2010. Peter is the author of more than 90 peer-reviewed articles and chapters. His scholarly work ranges widely across the humanities, creative arts, and the social sciences. He is coordinating editor of the Social Theory Journal, Thesis 11, which is a SAGE publication, and is chief investigator with Professor Simon Marchison of the University of Melbourne on an Australian Research Council Discovery Grant. Crucibles of Creativity, Australian Universities and Path-Breaking Intellectual Work. His latest book, Universities, Creativity and the Innovation Economy, will be published in 2014, as will his most recent co-edited scholarly collection, Aesthetic Capitalism. Please welcome to the stage for his inaugural lecture, Professor Peter Murphy.
As if with a crook knee you can actually get up to the lectern these days, you know. The mind is still functioning, but the body is a more ambiguous matter. And thank you, Robin, for that introduction. I guess take it down to business, I guess, which is simply defined by my opening observation that the incidence of creativity in OECD countries is in decline and has been for a long time. Pronounced downturn began in the 1970s and closely tracks the rise of mass higher education. A noticeable sharp downward turning point occurs around 1974. This is when the post-industrial, post-modern era commenced. While the rhetoric of the knowledge society encountered an age of supposed intense creation, the actual record of the period was tepid. The Mass University was a signature institution of the postmodern, post-industrial era. The singular failure of the era was the failure of that institution. It promised much, but delivered little. Universities relentlessly expanded after 1970 in number and size. They employed ever more academic staff, which meant ever more presumptive researchers. The same was true of large corporations with R&D departments and dedicated government scientific research institutions. In 1950, the number of scientists and engineers engaged in research and development in the United States was 1/4% of the workforce. By 1993, that figure had risen threefold to more than 0.75%. Yet the rise in unique discovery in the period was not threefold, far from it. The Stanford economist Charles A. Jones put it rather delicately when he said that if, quote, we double the number of researchers looking for ideas at a point in time, we may less than double the number of unique discoveries. Indeed so. After 1970, OECD countries spent a large amount of money on research and yet achieved only a minimal amount of advancement in the arts and sciences. The Australian case is typical. From 1993 to 2010, the amount Australia spent on the external funding of university research rose in real terms, this is all amounts in 2010 dollars, from $751 million to $3 billion, a fourfold real increase. In the same period, the output of research journal articles grew from around 21,000 to 33,000, a 1.6-fold increase. The size and return on investment in medical research is both revealing and typical of the dead end of postmodern creation. In 1947, the United States government established the National Institutes of Health funding body. In that year, its budget was $8 million. In the 2009 fiscal year, its budget was $29.5 billion. In real terms, accounting for population growth and inflation, American federal government spending on medical research had grown 237 times in the intervening period. Did breakthrough discoveries multiply by a factor of 237? No. What about by a factor of just 23? No. Cost rise in the biotechnology sector, not least because the cost of developing new drugs rises, not least because research costs rise. Yet what results do we get for all of that investment? The answer is surprisingly little anymore. Charlton and Endras in 2005, Vertman and Bettker in 1995 both observed that the big developments in biomedical science took place between 1935 and 1965, with key advances occurring in antibiotics, glucocorticoids, steroids, hormone replacement therapies, psychiatric drugs, surgical technique, anesthetics and DNA. The rate of major clinical advances has declined since then. Developments in cancer therapies, psychiatric drugs and new antibiotics have slowed to an incremental pace that's marked by a marginal benefit increase, often severe side effects, and very expensive clinical trialling. An auspicious mid-20th century period of biomedical science was followed by a marked increase in human life expectancy for those born between 1960 and 1980. Female life expectancy at birth in Australia in 1901 was 58. In 1980, it was 78. Over an 80-year lifespan, life expectancy increased 20 years. By 2006, life expectancy had increased a further 5 years to 83. While it had increased, the rate of increase slowed from a 1-year increase every 4 years to a 1-year increase every 5 years. At the same time, real levels of funding for medical research had catapulted in the period. By the 2000s, funding in real terms vastly exceeded by many orders of magnitude that of the propitious 1930 to 1965 era of medical science, the era of Howard Florey and Frank McFarlane Burnett. Yet scientific outcomes were visibly on the wane. In a more general sense, in the post-industrial era, the measure of scientific success shifted from outcomes to inputs. The more money secured for research, the more successful research was, accepting that it wasn't. The postmodern era was an age of proxies. Every imaginable substitute for the real thing, from peer review to citations to research income, served as a meagre replacement for actual discovery. Instead of measuring discovery, the many bureaucracies of the mass university system measured anything but discovery, in a futile attempt either to avert or to ignore the underlying decline and breakthroughs, the none of discovery. Thus, while cancer treatments continued to improve incrementally, definitive therapies or vaccines remained elusive, as did a unified theory of the cause of cancer. The gene associated with the Huntington's degenerative neurological disorder was discovered in 1993, and yet a cure for Huntington's malady remained stubbornly out of sight. While William Rutter and colleagues at the University of California in San Francisco isolated the gene for insulin in 1977, this allowed the mass production of genetically engineered insulin. Yet both the cause and cure of diabetes continued to elude researchers. Retroviruses were connected to the HIV/AIDS condition in the early 1980s, and life-extending antiviral suppressive therapies emerged quickly thereafter. And yet, no vaccine for the condition has been discovered, despite the large investment in research in the area. It's important to point out that it is not only government investment in ideas that has been to a significant degree fruitless. The same has been true of industry. Now, I don't know whether we got a handout. I was going to organise a handout for the Peter Thiel. Did that happen magically? Nearby. Okay, so it's something worth looking at. I'd put out a handout. Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal system, this week, recently in a video conversation, lamenting the fact that in his view, basically in the last 40 years, innovation, meaning innovation in industry, has dried up. Consider journalist Michael Mendel's 2009 observation about the multitude of promises that were made in the late 1990s about the then coming biomedical and other revolutions, in inverted commas. The world was assured of breakthrough cancer treatments, gene therapies, stem cell therapies, tissue engineering, high-speed satellite internet, cars powered by fuel cells, micro machines, chips, and so on. What happened to such products? Mendel asked. A decade later on, he noticed that no gene therapy had been approved for sale in the United States at that point. Rural dwellers could get satellite internet, but the service was far slower than what had been promised. The terrible economics of alternative energy had not changed much in a decade, and while the biotechnology industry had produced some important drugs, such as the cancer drugs Avastin and Gleevec, Mendel reflected that the gains in healthcare had been disappointing compared with the sums invested in research. Now, it is not just technological or biomedical ingenuity that has declined. Consider the field of the creative arts. In the visual arts, the period between 1890 and 1970, that is between Cézanne and Rothko, was outstanding. What followed was dismal. Almost any postmodern work, and is the period roughly speaking between 1970 and 2000, depending on how you count it, was forgettable, bar a handful. There are always exceptions to the rule. But exceptions like Gerhard Richter of the late period David Hockney unfortunately only prove the rule. Contemporary post-2000 digital media artworks are occasionally interesting, yet, as their ambivalent name suggests, they lack the kind of strong conceptual identity that marked the modernist era in art. Since the modernist period, art has been dominated either by kitsch concepts or by weak concepts. And the judgment of time on postmodern art already has been very severe. Don Thompson calculated, this is in 2008, calculated that of the 1,000 artists with major gallery shows in London and New York in the 1980s, only 20 of those artists were offered in evening auctions in Christie's or Sotheby's in 2007. Now, art without traction, art that is not memorable, art without longevity is not art. The contemporary creative deficit applies just as much to popular marketed artworks as it does to elite gallery artworks. Rolling Stone magazine's 2012 music industry poll of the top 500 music albums lists 11 works from the 1950s, 105 from the 1960s, 187 from the 1970s, 82 from the 1980s, sorry folks, it goes downhill from this, 75 from the 1990s, 38 from the 2000s, and of course the 2, but that doesn't matter, from the truncated 2010s. This collective judgment and the arc of creation it reveals is an accurate one. More interesting still are the figures from the 1970s. Now, technically, the creative output of the 1970s exceeds that of the 1960s, excepting that when one drills down into the Rolling Stone figures, what is revealed is that, this is a really interesting figure, that 50% of the best 1970s albums came from the first 4 years of the decade, that is the years 1970 to 1973 inclusive. And immediately after that point, there was a sharp drop-off in first-class output, and it's just like overnight, it suddenly plummets. The distinct downward shift after 1973 pinpoints the general problem of creation in the last 40 years. And I hasten to say that 1974 is the date of publication of Daniel Bell's very important work, which prophesies, as its title said, the coming of the post-industrial age. Yes, indeed, it came and started around that point. At the very moment when the multiple decades-long postmodern creative recession began, that is, in the 1970s, the philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis observed that the social impetus to discovery had begun to wane radically. And remember, he's saying this in the 1970s. At the time, he was virtually alone in noting this. The postmodern decades were filled with creative boosters, often of a very pretentious kind. Today, though, Castoriadis' then rather lonely observation has been eloquently confirmed by Dean Keith Simonton. Simonton is Professor of Psychology at the University of California at Davis. He spent 4 decades writing about creativity, and writing in rather interesting ways, I headed. In 2013, that is, I should say earlier this year, in January 2013, in the journal Nature, he bluntly stated that the kind of scientific originality that characterised the eras of Michelson and Morley or Einstein had abated. Imaginative leaps today have become much rarer. It's not that they don't exist, but they're much rarer. Domain-specific expertise now dominates science, and while scientific knowledge still advances, it does so on the whole without expanding the deep set foundations of knowledge. And as you'll see in the second or the third part of this paper, that begins to be a real problem. So, let me ask a fundamental question. Let's hypothetically assume this is all true. The question then arises, why is this so? Well, there are several key factors. The phenomena is not monocausal in nature. And yet all of the factors influencing it are directly or indirectly related, I'm going to suggest, to the factor of scale or size. Or simply put, the arts, the sciences and the universities have grown too large. The bigger the creative sectors have become, the more they've expanded beyond an optimal point. The lower the incidence of per capita creativity, and the more that the rate of unique discovery in the arts and sciences has slowed down. Now, a way of better understanding this is to revisit the instructive work of Derek Price. Price was a physicist and a historian of science. He was one of the founders, along with Alfred Lotka, of the field of bibliometrics, the study of the science of publishing, for want of a better term. In 1963, Price identified a key statistical pattern of research publishing. This is Price's square root law of research. To fully understand the significance of Price's square root law, some additional background is first necessary. So bear with me while I go through some background and I'll come back to Price's law. The origin of Price's law goes back to the pioneering paper by Alfred Lotka in 1926 on the frequency distribution of scientific productivity. In that paper, Lotka examined a large sample of scientific publication data. The bulk of Lotka's data came from the 1907 to 1916 series of chemical abstracts. It encompassed 6,981 contributors to the chemistry research literature, who had produced 22,939 research records, either publications or notes or some small entry, depending. Lotka's sample was the entries under the letters A and B of the chemical abstracts. The key thing that Lotka identified was the highly skewed distribution of research output. Simply put, a very large amount of research is produced by a small number of researchers, while a large number of researchers produce a small amount each, or small output each. If we revisit Lotka's original chemical abstracts data, what that reveals is an average output per person per annum of 0.33 items, a third of an item each per year. In contrast, the average output for the top 10% most frequent contributors was 1.68 items per person per annum. The top 1% produced 5 items per person per annum. The top 2% produced 4 items per person per annum. The bottom 58% of authors contributed 1 item in a decade and 17% of the total output. The top 25% of most frequent authors contributed 73% of the total. Wayne Dennis later confirmed this pattern of output. He found a similar skewed distribution in a 1955 study. And all studies since, and in fact our experience in the universities and other research institutions and so on, simply confirmed the pattern. It's a law of research. Lotka noted other patterns in the data that he collected. In particular, he observed that the number of persons making 2 contributions to the research literature was about 1/4, or 2 squared, of those making 1 contribution. Those making 3 contributions is about 1/9, 3 squared, of those making 1 contribution, and so on. Those who made 100 contributions were about 1/10,000, 100 squared, as common as a single contributor. Lotka offered a law of research output in light of this observed pattern. The number making n contributions is 1 divided by n squared, those making 1 contribution. Derek Price subsequently reformulated Lotka's law. Price proposed that if there are n numbers of scholars in the field, then the square root of n will produce 50% of papers in the field. As for example, if there are 100 scholars in a field, then 10 of them will produce 50% of the papers in the field. If there are 1,000, then 31 will produce 50% of the papers, and so on. D. Keith Simonton later noted that Price's law was a simpler, yet cruder, and thus less accurate measure of predicted output than Lotka's. However, Price's starting point was different from Lotka. Price wanted to answer the leitmotif of Lotka's paper. It would be of interest, Lotka had declared, to determine, if possible, the part which men of different calibre contribute to the progress of science, end quote. This is what Price pursued. The question of research productivity was important, but secondary to the question of research calibre. That said, said, Price and others, including Simonton, concluded that productivity and calibre were nevertheless strongly correlated. High calibre researchers tend to be very productive, even if the converse cannot be guaranteed, namely that a highly productive researcher is of high calibre. Either way, the number of productive researchers and the number of eminent researchers is small. This is the word I'm going to concentrate on as I move through towards the end of the paper. It's this question of smallness. What Price defined was the law of calibre. Price proposed that the total number of scientists is the square of the number of good ones, or conversely, the number of stellar contributors to a field is the square root of the total number of contributors to the field. The implications of this will become clearer as we move on. The implications of Price's law are significant. It means, simply put, that good science is small science. This is the root of our contemporary problems. And this is true as much for the arts as it is for the sciences. Indeed, in many respects for the creative arts, it is doubly true. That is to say, even more so than for the sciences. It is true that a very tiny number of highly productive creators dominate the visual and performing arts. Employing more researchers and creators cannot reverse the law of small numbers. If anything, it intensifies it. In 1963, Price observed that the time it was taking for the number of scientists to double was 3 times faster than the time it was taking for the general population to double. Just think about that for a moment. The problem with this is that the number of eminent contributors to a field over time cannot grow faster than the rate of population growth. So here we've got two things in contradiction with each other. This means that if a field is growing faster for a long time than the general population is, then the larger the field gets, the poorer the field becomes. The same applies to the arts and sciences as a whole. Price made the imperishable point. Increasing the number of researchers may increase the number of research papers, but it will not increase the number of distinguished papers. The number of persons who create work that is exceptional, distinguished, accomplished or noteworthy remains a constant proportion of the larger population. Growing the number of scientists or artists faster than the growth of the general population does not change that fact. This is because, as Price also observed, while every doubling of the population had produced at least 3 doublings of the number of scientists as far back as the 17th century, the number of entries in dictionaries of national biography over time remained a constant proportion of the population. In 1874, Francis Galton calculated that 1 in 20,000 of the general population is an eminent person, and 1 in 100,000 of the general population is an eminent scientist. If we include the social sciences, humanities and creative arts, that latter figure becomes 1 in 75,000 persons. Price later noted that the starred names in Jane McKean-Cattell's 1903 to 1960 biographical dictionary, American Men of Science, made up a portion of the population similar to that which Galton had calculated. In the 50 years prior to 1963, the number of American scientists, however, grew 16-fold, doubling about every 12.5 years, while the American population in those 50 years grew 2-fold, from 92 million to 179 million. After 1970, the post-industrial era replicated this growth differential on a mass scale. For example, from 1989 to 2009, full-time faculty in American degree-granting institutions expanded from just over 500,000 to over 700,000, a 0.4 fraction increase, while the general US population grew from 246 million to 307 million, a 0.2 increase, half of the rate of the faculty increase. So again, faculty is rising, not in proportion to the general rate of population increase, which became the key syndrome, the key factor in defining the higher education of the post-industrial age. Simply put, the illusion of the knowledge society was that we could multiply discoverers faster than the general population, and its constant fraction of inventive souls. Well, this is just not possible to do. And in fact, at the level of disciplines, the averse is true. That is to say, more is less. Consider the case of economics. In the 1930s and 1940s, it was an intellectually powerful discipline. It was distinguished by figures like Schumpeter, Hayek, and Keynes. One of them, Hayek, even predicted the onset of the Great Depression. He was almost alone among economists in doing so. Consider then the effects of time and size. The American Economic Association had 572 members in 1893, 2,621 members in 1936, and 16,944 members in 2009. Using Price's law, that gross membership translates to 23, 51, and 118 outstanding contributors respectively. It is little wonder then that in 2008-2009, in response to the global financial crisis, most of the American and international economics profession endorsed Keynesian pump priming government spending techniques that in the past had repeatedly failed. These techniques had almost zero effect in reversing the world's economic downturn. The economic advisors to the Obama administration predicted that as a result of its supersized $831 billion stimulus spending package in 2009, the unemployment rate in the United States in the third quarter of 2013 would be 5%. In the second quarter of 2013, it was still 7.5%. In June 2013, the American economy had 2 million fewer jobs than it did in January 2008. Now, what is at issue here is not simply or only predictive failure, though the predictive failure is serious. What is also at issue is the near unanimous support of economists for theories that spawn wrong predictions. Unanimity points to intellectual conformity, hardly the animating spirit of discovery. Underlining this is the monoculture of a discipline grown too large and the accompanying failure of imagination. The discipline's monoculture, I'm not just picking on economics here, I'm just using this as an illustration of a more general problem. The discipline's monoculture is reflected in the voting and political preferences of American economists. For example, Klein and Stern in 2007 surveyed American Economic Association economists. The researchers report that very few, in precisely 3% only, of the 264 survey respondents held strong free market views. Most either leant towards or supported government activism. The Democrat to Republican voting ratio of American economists is 2.5 to 1. Now, there's nothing surprising in those figures. With the rise of the mass university came political homogeneity, followed by intellectual homogeneity. Even though one might have expected the growth in the size of the university sector to have increased intellectual diversity, the converse happened. The consequence is that when poor predictions occur, as they will, there are now very few faculty left proposing alternative theories that offer different predictions. Declining predictive power is a sign of sciences that are in trouble. So also is the rapid obsolescence and outright invalidity of knowledge. Now, it's well established that the postmodern era had a problem with truth. Truth implies that knowledge is accurate, sound, and reliable. Yet much of what presents as knowledge today is none of those things. In 2002, Thierry Poignard and his co-researchers and the expert reviewers they called in looked at almost 500 articles on the liver diseases, cirrhosis and hepatitis. The article had been published over more than, the articles that they looked at had been published over more than 50 years. What they found was that 60% of the conclusions drawn in those articles were still considered true, 19% were obsolete, and 21% were false. Derek Price had previously observed that truth had a half-life. The half-life of truth is the point at which 50% of the published research on a subject is either out of date or wrong. Poignard and colleagues concluded the half-life of the truth of the research that they examined was 45 years. Now, think about it. That is not really a very long time. Following Price's lead, Samuel Armsman in 2012, last year, nicknamed this the half-life of facts. Obsolete knowledge is unavoidable to a point. But how much obsolescence and what speed of obsolescence and how much accumulated false knowledge can be borne by science or social science before its credibility is shot? The advancement of knowledge ought not to be confused with the progress of knowledge. Knowledge advances when additional true knowledge is discovered and secured. In contrast, knowledge progresses by the belated discovery of falsehood and the consequent disposal of it. The latter gives us short, disciplined half-lives. This is a lot less compelling than the accumulation of durable knowledge. Related to the fascination with falsification is the desire to dispense with truth as a sceptical check on claims to knowledge. Consequently, today many fake facts and spurious explanations follow. One reason for this is that invalid findings of scientific studies are accepted as valid at the time they are produced because no one bothers at the time to test them or to double check them. Science says, or the study reports, has become the effective pseudo-validation of knowledge. Eventually such findings are falsified, but by other studies years later. In between time, billions in public spending can rest upon specious science. This is especially so in the postmodern age, increase the propensity of authors to make statements like science tells us or the science is settled. In doing so, the public posture of science has moved from the sceptical to the authoritarian. The past 40 years has seen a significant decline in the arts and sciences. And this is directly and indirectly the predicted effect of the operation of Price's law. In 1963, Price forecast the eventual entropy of all intellectual fields in the sciences due to the spiritual dominance of each field's periphery. What he predicted for the natural sciences is equally true of the social sciences, the creative arts and the humanities. As a field grows rapidly or exponentially for a time, its long tail and its shallow margins eventually overshadow and delay the strong, yet always tiny core, emphasis on tiny. Nominally, knowledge may be produced in greater quantities, and yet this occurs with diminishing intellectual returns. As a field grows, knowledge is stripped of imagination. Emphasis tacitly falls on dissemination in place of creation. Knowledge becomes characterised incrementally by ever larger portions of tepidness, ineffectuality, and inhibition. In such a context, fewer and fewer great works are incubated. The ecology of dissemination is different from the ecology of creation. The larger the field grows, the larger becomes the gap in numbers between core and peripheral contributors. Dissemination, interpretation, and spreading the word are crucial to inquiry. Researchers need readers, artists need audiences. Yet, there is a point at which dissemination feeds back into the discovery core and corrodes it. Intellectual fields are like supernovas. Beyond a certain point, their growth is a prelude to entropy and eventual extinction. These fields burn their creative fuel, they die out. This is what's happening to contemporary research. Derek Price calculated that between 1650 and 1950, the number of records in science journals, which includes, articles, reviews, notice extracts, and so on, grew at an annual rate of 4.5% and doubled every 10 to 15 years. Now, examining the evidence for the period between 1907 and 2007, Larson's and Innes in 2010, calculate that in the aggregate, the rate of doubling has been subsequently maintained. Yet, beneath that headline number, a much bleaker picture emerges, with the rate of growth of core science disciplines declining sharply. The headline figure, in fact, is only secured by compensating growth in the applied science disciplines of medicine, computer and electronic engineering and technology. And these, we have seen, are displaying also their own evident weaknesses. At the same time, the core sciences, mathematics, physics and chemistry, have been sharply declining since 1974, with doubling times increasing to the 20 and 30-year scale. If the core sciences look bad, then consider the state of the social sciences. The growth rate for the Social Science Citation Index for the period 1987 to 2006 was 1.6% per year for all records and 2% per year for journal articles. The corresponding doubling times were 44 and 37 years. Essentially, the social sciences are dying. Mathematics, chemistry and physics are not far behind. Data from the Google Ngram word and phrase search in the Google Books database of 5.2 million books published between 1500 and 2008, containing 500 billion words, I challenge anybody to read them all, reveals a similar picture. Use of the terms mathematics, physics and chemistry declines after 1964, biology after 2000, engineering after 1990, computer science after 1990. The incidence of biotechnology and information technology words flatlines in the decade of the 2000s. Biomedicine is a rare word cluster that continues to grow. Its time will come. The terms social science, sociology and political science decline after 1970, and economics does so after 1990. Interestingly, philosophy, history and literature, as well as art and architecture, sit on a 2-century plateau, not growing, and yet not declining. One of the reasons for this, the only one, but one of the reasons for this is that after 1970, the creative arts and the humanities did not share in the post-industrial knowledge boom. They shrank in size relative to health and technology and the business and social sciences. Now, being a minnow in a sea of big sharks has its dangers, but also its virtues. For when the fall comes, as it must eventually, the small fry have a much shorter distance to drop. That's an institutional metaphor. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so it appears to the arts and sciences. This means that as major areas of research have declined or flatlined, marginal areas have risen up. Since the 1970s, references to subsidiary and secondary, peripheral and fringe forms of inquiry have grown. This is a reminder that the era of the knowledge society produced endless reams of spurious, negligible and borderline knowledge. The prophet of the age was undoubtedly Paul Frower. His 1975 work against method was a primer on the epistemology of anything goes. And here you can look at on the samples of the slide examples of some of what went.
Yes, quite.
knowledge is declining in our time, isn't it? It's comforting, it warms my heart. Once created, fields of inquiry grow and often grow rapidly. This is beginning the last section of the lecture. Beyond a certain point, growth switches from, okay, look, I'm going to start there again. I'm tired, I've travelled the world today, deciding which country I'm in. Once created, fields of inquiry grow and often grow rapidly. But beyond a certain point, this is a tricky but, growth switches from being a positive to a negative. Success becomes a kind of failure. A model for visualising this is inception, contagion, saturation. At its inception, a field is small and highly charged. Beyond a certain threshold, as numbers of practitioners multiply, a contagion starts. The more practitioners, the more contact between practitioners, the more the contagion spreads. The mark of contagion is rapid growth. The rapid growth, though, eventually slows. It ends in saturation. Derek Price proposed that when graphed, the pattern of takeoff, explosive growth, saturation looks like a logistic curve, an S-shaped symmetrical curve. Price also estimated that explosive growth would occur for 5 to 6 periods of rapid doubling before slacking off. Accordingly, how long does it take a major intellectual or artistic field then to go from the first point of acceleration to the point of saturation? If we assume an average of 5.8 periods of rapid doubling before saturation and 12 years as the average time span for rapid doubling to occur, then the average time span of a discipline from acceleration to saturation is 70 years. The history of intellectual discovery looks a lot like a series of intersecting logistic curves, such that the inception of one adventive field coincides with the saturation of another one. This, by the way, resembles the pattern of Kondratiev waves of economic growth in industrial society since the late 18th century. Both display overlapping curves of saturation and inception. Growth is an unambiguous plus in modern economies. Growth in major economies in the past 2 centuries has been unprecedented. There is nothing else like it in human history, and may it go on. One of the reasons this happened is that major growth economies were successful at translating science into industry technology and social science into industry organisation. But in the post-industrial era, economic growth rates in the major established economies began to drop. Indicators give a strong hint that as the underlying real rate of discovery and creativity has declined, so has long-term economic growth in those societies. The irony of this is that it is likely that economic growth has in fact been stymied by the growth of the arts and sciences. This is because while growth is an unalloyed positive for economies, beyond an optimal point, note my qualification, beyond an optimal point, possibly a very modest optimal point, growth is a negative for culture and science. This is the paradox of intellectual productivity. The larger the science, the less we create. The bigger the field, the fewer are the works of lasting importance. The more money we spend on research, the less we get in real terms in return for that expenditure. Now, I'm afraid the historical record is strongly suggestive that this is true. Even though numbers in the arts and sciences outstrip population growth from probably roughly the 1450s onwards, it's a long time ago, number of scientists and artists in the population still remain tiny relative to population until the 20th century. Even if 19th century Bohemians had an exaggerated opinion of themselves, no one talked about a creative class science in their time. There was no creative economy for officials and commissions to collect statistics about. Discoveries in medical science and technology in the period from 1935 to 1965 are notable. Nevertheless, most of the landmark achievements in the arts and sciences occur before this and long before the 20th century. The peak of creative work in the core natural sciences occurs at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century. In mathematics, it's the late 16th and the 17th century. In medicine, the 19th century. In technology, the key period is from the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century. In Western philosophy, the latter part of the 17th century and the latter part of the 18th century. In Western art, it is during the 15th, early 16th and first half of the 17th century. Western literature crests at the end of the 16th century and then in the end in the 19th century. And Western art music in the mid-16th, early 17th and early 18th century. All of this work involved tiny numbers of practitioners operating in small milieus. Tiny, small. We have reversed this. We've created large institutions and hired a large number of practitioners, and we've ended up with comparatively minuscule results. This does not mean that we do not get significant outcomes, but we do get relatively far fewer of them. Simply put, I'm heading towards my conclusion. Simply put, big science does not work. Big social science does not work. The big humanities and the big arts do not work. Above all, big universities and big university sectors do not work. The big university works no more than big government does. Indeed, the former is simply an extension of the latter. The power of tiny numbers is a recurrent feature of outstanding culture and science. But what exactly do we mean by big and small? How big is big? And how small is small? Well, in concluding, I shall put a precise number on this. The university sector in advanced societies, in my estimate, should be half the size it is today. As previously noted, Francis Galton calculated that the number of eminent scientists in the population is 100,000 persons. If we add social, cultural and creative fields, that scales to 1 in 175,000 people. We can extrapolate from those figures for our own purposes to our own condition. Universities have eminent, distinguished and talented faculty. Let's further assume that 1 in 75 faculty is eminent, 6 in 75 is distinguished, and the other 68 in 75 are talented. Now let's take the case of Australia. Its 2009 population, and Australia's 2009 population is 21 million people. That predicts 280 eminent academics and an academic population of 21,000 in total. In actuality, Australia had 45,000 full-time academic staff in 2009, about twice as many as the model would predict. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So Peter has agreed to take some questions. There are some questions from the floor. Up back.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether there are too many of us here to set up an outstanding new university.
I don't think this applies at all to specific universities, and I would actually warn very strenuously against so applying it. There's always been a spectrum of universities, and whether we're talking about let's say from the late 19th century onwards, for at least the last 100 or 130 years, we've had a full spectrum of universities. The talent of any description for the spectrum from eminence to talent is never has been concentrated only in specific institutions and not in others. And the way the distribution of talent goes is, as long as you have institutions, you will get a spread of talent, from the eminent to the talented across all institutions. And so this most pointedly is not intended in any way to make that claim that simply you remove institutions and you solve your problem. You don't do that at all. And in fact, if you notice where I know this is personal experience, but from observation and from metrics, is today in Australia, the institutions that are most, in fact, really in a way most struggling with this problem are those that are at the notional, at the top end of the spectrum. And so fixing this problem is not by carrying out surgery on institutions. It doesn't work like that.
Other questions?
If the numbers of eminent, distinguished, and talented scientists is still increasing,
Yeah.
what's getting in their way? Is it the not distinguished, not talented, and not eminent scientists?
I think I was pretty clear. I think I was pretty clear in suggesting that size of field matters, and as fields grow, they become, the work that they produce overall is less distinguished, and the most interesting work, generally speaking, that we've got going back over the last 200 years comes out earlier rather than later in fields. So fields are the favour of fields as a consequence of their success, essentially.
Yes, over the back.
Is it possible that some of this, in fact, is due simply to the fact that basically early in the history of fields, stuff is easy, and later in the history of fields, stuff is actually hard?
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of a view floating around that as people, I think, starting to realise that there are these kinds of underlying problems. One is the low-hanging fruit thesis, right? And I think I radically object to that thesis. That's that I want to turn it on its head. And the most fundamental discoveries, it would seem to me, represent the greatest difficulty, and that, and often precisely that they do occur either early in the period or when fields remain relatively small. But that's, rather than be suggesting that that means it's easier, I would suggest that that's where the really hard work occurs. And I think one of the things that I would also say related to that is that, I guess what I'm suggesting here is that smallness has something to do with the, I guess, the capacity of people to create, and it's partly affected by growth, but it's also partly conditioned when a field is in a small state by people who see what other people have not seen before. And I think that that's one of the great conditions of the creative process, is simply the capacity to see what others do not see. And there's everything to suggest in the history of ideas, the history of science, is that that belongs to a smaller rather than a larger number of people.
You seem to have totally ignored the technological boom of the last 50 years and also input of people to growth and ideas outside institutions.
Well, I hope to have distributed today the Peter Thiel's observation. Peter Thiel, co-founder of PayPal, who's in conversation this week, and the video, he's in conversation with Andy Kessler. I would recommend everybody to do a Google search and have a look, particularly if you open Peter Thiel's opening comments. And Thiel in that, and I agree completely with the proposition, is that what he's done, he's not alone, and I'm not alone in saying that the technological innovation, once we get outside the realm of computing, technology innovation of the last 40 years is much poorer than it is often claimed to be. and that in areas from, say, the manufacture of aircraft through to the cost of energy, the relative cost of energy, we are in a no better position today than we were in the 1960s or 1970s. And I think this is one of the things that people need to come to terms with, is a lot of the mythology or the boosterism of post-industrial age. A lot of people got paid very large salaries to go out and say a fantastic and miraculous thing was happening, and I think we're starting to get to the point where it's becoming less and it's becoming more and more clear that there wasn't a fantastic and miraculous thing happening, because if there had been, our growth rates, our GDP and our growth rates and our productivity, which is all driven by this stuff and has been for the last 200 years, would be in a much better condition than they are today. And you will hear now with the election of the new government a lot of talk now about Australia's productivity, because Australia's productivity has collapsed through the ceiling. We've had two good periods of productivity in the last 50 years, the 1960s, and a small boost in the late 1990s, and the rest is actually terrible, and we are running on empty. And part of the reason we're running on empty is we now believe our own publicity that the last 40 years of technology was good, and it was good in some places. And I'm saying, yes, there are some good things that happen, but they are looking more and more like not the rule but the exception to the rule.
The paper that Peter's talking about, there are copies outside on the table, so if you actually
If somebody go home, Peter's homework.
Peter's homework.
It's a long time since I've been up to send homework.
There was a question over here somewhere. Yep.
So first a comment, Peter, that as a field grows, you become relatively more ignorant. So the more there is, the less you actually know. But the second thing is, thinking back on my own career, 30 years ago when I started lab work, I'd be going to a lab and I could more or less do it. The safety was, don't kill yourself.
And even some people are good ambiguous about that.
No, I succeeded. But I left because ultimately you couldn't do anything. I just couldn't do experiments anymore. The safety just overtook. And I wonder whether this era, postmodernism also is the growth of, excuse me, Robin, managerialism and the cold dead hand of bureaucracy.
You wax quickly. It did. Listen to that man. He's great. and there's a deep irony about this. 1970s, beginning of the postmodern age, the advocates of postmodernism, they all come out of the 60s student radical movement. They all promised the very opposite. They promised us that they would get rid of bureaucracy, they'd get rid of rules, they'd get rid of this, that and the other. But overnight they all turned into a moralising generation that began to point the finger, tell us what to do, and the way to actually get us to do what they wanted to do was to create larger and larger bureaucracies. And consequently our universities have become sort of simply one large bureaucratic machine. So I keep pointing out that 60% of every dollar that comes into university goes into bureaucratic administration. And in a way, this has become also the post-industrial solution to the absence of jobs. As economies have declined, we've created these fake jobs in bureaucratic institutions.
It's a bit like the public service, really, seeing and doing. We're creating a lot of paperwork, but really achieving very little, if anything, at all.
Correct, and that becomes part of the problem of the sciences,
Universities and public
sciences and the
service.
social sciences, the arts for that matter. So that the arts grant becomes more important than the art work, and the work itself diminishes over time, and other things take over.
There's three things I'd like to comment on.
Yeah.
The first being the definition of innovation creative is very subjective. Everyone has different interpretations of what it might mean. The second being, as you mentioned here, there are external factors that impact the ease at which someone can be creative or innovative. So whether that's in Canada shutting down research on electric cars to protect the car industry, or in the States, religious views of political parties and stem cell research, whatever the case may be. So those external factors play a role. And the third being, there's a bit of sometimes there's a delay in the realization of greatness. So Van Gogh died penniless, Edgar Allan Poe died poor. So potentially, we're not seeing greatness that is there currently. We won't for a number of years as that
question of delay because I've been very interested in the post-1970s thing. I'm aware that some take up or some recognition or the ranking process itself of what's significant and insignificant does take time. Having said that, we do live in the age of social media where everything happens instantaneously, and I'm told constantly by the efforts of social media that I can find out everything about everything straight away. So I'm confused.
It's the realization, it's not the discovery, it's the realization that it is great.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean, but that also means people making judgments and then revising those judgments and then revise. There is a process that goes on, and my rule of thumb tends to say that, like any artwork the last 50 years and is regarded significant 50 years after it's created, is certainly significant work, and it is more difficult to deal with the period from 19 up to quite 50-year mark. However, having said that, I know, for example, when people do collections of major scientific papers, right? The point after the 1930s was great for major scientific papers. Oh, it's unbelievable numbers that are produced there, right? And 1920s and 30s, fantastic. After the 1970s, it plummets. And now I ask myself two questions. Is it plummeting simply because it's closer to us and people can't make up their mind what's great or not great science? And I acknowledge that can be affected. But at the same time, it's seeing such a plummet is, and really not just, in the 1990s or the last decade, but I'm seeing the plummet happening in the 1970s and 1980s. And time is kicking on, and I'm not seeing people reevaluating their opinion particularly, and I'm not seeing the things that, one of the things that I have a sort of hobby interest in is cosmology. And I would like to say that all the kind of popular pet theories that I thought were very interesting, say coming out in the 1990s, were really delivering on the goods, and there's nothing to suggest that they are. So it is difficult because it's more recent, but that's the case with dealing with the more recent periods and the evaluation of more recent periods. I'm not denying that there's not issues, but I don't think the issue, but what I'm seeing on the other side is the empirical evidence seems so strong of a kind of a big drop in the recognition. I mean, Einstein was recognised, once they did the predictions of the sun eclipse and that sort of thing, he became a household name like that in a really serious way, and also of profound scientific input. And I'm not seeing the equivalent of that today, and I really haven't seen that since the work of the 1950s on the discovery of the architecture of DNA. Okay, what was the second? The middle question was?
External factors, so...
you used the case of government shutting down production of electric cars. I don't think much of electric cars, we probably might disagree on that.
Or religious meanings of political bias.
Well, I don't know people understandings. In fact, a lot of the best science was produced in England in the 19th century, what people who came from the city.
Limiting the research funding towards stem cell research, for example, because of...
Yeah, well, stem cell research has still gone on. Federal government closed it down, but it was still funded by state governments in the United States and seemed to do a great deal for stem cell research. And there has been some advance in stem cell thing, but I don't think that the problems that I'm pointing to are going to be explained by direct local political factors. Apart from anything else, I'm dealing with the whole of the OECD, and the Europeans said that they were taking over stem cell research from the bad Bush administration. And, we heard all those stories, and we're still waiting for the really great advances in stem cell research. And I'm not denying that it can't come. All I'm looking at is, in a sense, is an overall pattern, and I have to say that the overall pattern, even if we could stand up and say that there was tremendous discovery in stem cell research, it would look rather lonely when you looked at the whole larger terrain of outcomes and outputs and performance of science, and indeed, and don't forget the social sciences and the arts today. I mean, the American critic Camille Paglia described creative arts today as an article in the Wall Street Journal last year as a wasteland. That was the description. And so what I'm suggesting is it's not necessarily specific to, it's not confined to a specific discipline or area or even to the sciences, but there's a larger problem that we have. And on the question of subjectivity, Well, I would actually disagree. I think there's a lot of fairly clear indicators about what creativity is. We've been testing creativity now for 40 plus years. There's been interesting research done recently on the Torrance test for creativity. Researching the 300,000 tests that have been applied since the 1960s on a huge population, and looking at performance of people in the United States on those tests. And again, the surprising and the unexpected thing is that on some measures since the 1980s and across the board since 1990, performance on the Torrance test for creativity has been declining over time, and most interestingly of all, the worst decline has been registered in the very young, that is kids in kindy, which suggests that there's a broad cultural, social something going on, and that we actually have a problem when kids are seeming less creative according to well-established measures, which are quite sensible. I would suggest that there is a broad problem beginning to emerge. And I saw a recent interesting comment from a Boston psychologist recently dealing with a debate about measuring learning performance in schools. And as we know in Australia, it was drove Gillard's policy. What's the name of the expansion of the education funding in Australia? The Gonski. Sorry. It was driving Gonski that Australian performance on this standardised test are declining, and children in Hong Kong and Singapore are doing much better than Australian children and American children. And I think there's a counter argument to that, and saying that there are other significant measures of performance, and that in particular with children, there are a number of psychologists beginning to observe how child play, and in fact play not just in kindergarten but right through the schooling years is being increasingly reduced, and that a child's experience in primary or high school is quite unlike mine. Mine, I would be able to roam free, much like this gentleman was able to roam free in his laboratory. I could roam free through suburban nature. That's disappearing. And so I want to suggest that there may be larger contextual factors, to come back to your contextual factors, to do with, for example, the diminishing of play in a society that's actually affecting the creative cognition of us.
Okay, there's a question in the front, and then there's a couple of
Actually, I was going to move the conversation in the direction that you just took us, either in terms of contextual factors. So I was wondering if you might play with some contextual factors. One that occurs to me is the process of education, competition for funds, and so forth. So education, I won't touch on. You alluded to the Creative Research Journal study on the TTCT friendly amendment on that, though. It wasn't kindergarten, it was 6th grade. So it was age about 10 or 11. Originality and fluency increased to about 6th grade, and there was a precipitous drop, never to regain itself again. But another contextual factor that I'm wondering about is in terms of funding. What I'm told with national funding agencies like the National Science Foundation, where there's great competition for funding, these agencies tend not to put funds towards risky ventures.
Yes.
So does that...
The last thing we will get in the Australian context, we have the ARC and the Scott Gray project, it's the same thing.
Yeah, so do you see any corrupting influence in terms of agencies and the funding models that are used and not taking risks and so forth?
You're not setting out to speak truth about it.
I'm just asking to explore content.
Yes. I think there are actually serious problems, and funding is one of the proxy factors that's come into play, particularly since the end of the 1980s. I mean, people got funding before then if they needed money to carry out, but it's become an institution imperative. In fact, some universities, many university, certainly in Australia, I'm sure it's in the United States, and certainly in the UK, they can solve their financial problems by generating research income, even though for every dollar research income they receive, it actually costs them in reality $1.5 to actually administer it and get it and keep it and waste it and whatever else they do with it. So, it's the problem, there's so many problems to do with this. It's the problem of replacing intrinsic curiosity by external drivers. That's the first thing. Think about creativity. You want to do it, you want to get up in the morning, you want to do it despite obstacles. Creative people, one of the chief psychological characteristics of creative people is that they are incredibly persistent. They will do, put them in the worst possible situation and they will continue to think creatively. They're ornery, so I think to use some of the American vernacular that I watched on TV, but I made special notes. So there's that. It's the sense of whereas one of the things about grant funding, for example, it's a short life cycle, right? I think one of the things I've come to as a conclusion, because I'm doing a lot of research around this, and this is part of the book I'm writing, and I did a calculation of what I figured it would require in order to have a productive career, in terms of those measurements of what a productive career is. And I think I came to, I'm still kind of fiddling with the figures, throwing them up and down, but it'd be something like sort of 60 articles in a career, and or sort of, 6 books with 10 chapters. So that, and the numbers are not, the numbers are not important, and it can be less than that. And when you look at highly creative people across the domains of the creative arts and sciences and so on, they are very productive. But one of the reasons I think that's important is it's not for the sheer quantity of production. It's not a numbers game, it's a longevity game. In order to have really good ideas, it's a long process. Even if you have them young, they've actually gestated, and certain ideas. I'm sure Einstein started thinking about, at least a decade before, he got a cold and had a fever and came up, whatever he did, I think the key thing about creation, it takes a long time. Whereas grant agencies think in 2, 3 or 4 year periods, that's first of all basically wrong. And I think the other thing about grant agencies is that they are a grant agency. They are an agency. They actually are a bureaucratic instrument. In order to get money out of the bureaucracy, you have to apply to the bureaucracy. You have to apply to people like me, right? You can wear my official hat, right? You have to have a form, right? Robin can actually say,
once he signed, I have signed.
that's great. And how responsible I am. You're waiting for their forms. Yeah, sure. Okay. Now, think about what a form means for the process of discovery. In a science or an arts project, or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It has a bit of thing that says, tell me what your project is. But which basically means that for the ASD, there's to be, tell us what you're going to discover. Well, let me tell you. You can't. And in fact, it's very clear from history, this is where the history of science is really, because it's better written up, say, than a lot of the history of the arts is that great discoveries come by accident, albeit they were well prepared. Accidents, and Alexander Fleming discovered, whatever it is, yeah, but by accident. But of course, when the accident happened, Fleming recognised what was going on, and that is so true of great discoveries. And I'm sure in a way there are actually strong parallels in the creative arts as well. I mean, we call it in the creative arts intuition. I don't know what I'm doing, I can't really explain what artists are really, lousy at explaining themselves. That doesn't, I've read a whole, centuries worth of artists' books, and they talk about what they do. They're not very illuminating. Paul Clay's descriptions of what he did has fantastic illustrations. And that's it.
Yeah, okay. We're running out of time, and I know there's lots of questions, but we'll be able to adjourn outside and continue to talk to Peter Iverson. So Senator Rees.
I would like to take
Yeah,
Thank you,
it
Susan.
as it's been a long wait, and I'm impressed, Peter, with the amount of statistics and managerial figures that you have applied to your talk.
Yeah.
I'm also curious to know why you focus on the research end of the university when there are, if you want to reverse the tables and numbers that you've given us,
Yeah.
the bulk of the university is not about research. And so we could question...
Can I answer that very quickly by saying that what you've heard tonight is part of the book on universities.
I beg your pardon?
Part of what you hear tonight is the book on the universities. And the book on the universities covers everything. You can't cover everything in a lecture. But having said that, I have no disagreement that the sorts of issues that crop up here in the context of research also have implications in the context of other parts of the university. Now, for example, Ian before gave a very good description of his good experience at university. They let him run free. That was my experience at university. That does not happen today. Students are not allowed to run free. Universities are fundamentally a place of self-learning. However, because of the number of things that we have done to universities and that governments have required universities to do to universities, nobody runs free in a university anymore. Therefore, we have basically systematically extinguished the creative process in the university.
So I haven't...